Hey guys, what's up? It's your boy from Down Under, Daydream Deluxe, and I know exactly what you're thinking. Daydream, are you seriously making another video about future funk? You bet your goddamn ass I am. But for good reason, because this kind of serves as a sequel to the history of future funk. There was already something in that video that I very briefly mentioned that kind of served as a future funk forefather, and I had to do a video on this particular topic because, well, it's adjacent to the Phantom's Revenge, who we all know is one of the future funk forerunners of the whole scene. But when I was making the history of future funk, I didn't know whether or not to continue making the video a lot longer than it already needed to be, because remind you that video is almost 20 minutes long, but this one's even longer. The fact of the matter is that I decided to save it for its own video because, like I said, it's longer than the history of future funk, so here we are. And not to mention, a very, very special guest is in this video, and he's going to be giving us a whole tour on how it all came to fruition and his personal thoughts on future funk and vaporwave. And before we get into the video, we are doing our first vinyl giveaway on this channel. Make sure you stick around to the end of the video because that's when I'm going to be announcing the details on what the vinyl is and, of course, how you can enter to win. So, without further ado, let's get straight into the video.
There's already a lot that I managed to cover in the history of future funk, where we analyse the foundation of the term, the first record to be dubbed as future funk, the nostalgic imagery, and some of its forefathers from Daft Punk to the Phantom's Revenge. Though it was great to put it on the web and give people a background check on how everything came to fruition, I couldn't help but think that there was something missing from that video that needed to be mentioned. But a little while later, I decided to save it for another project and give it its own video. If you haven't already seen the history of future funk, I have a link to the essay in the description below, and it will give you a good analysis on just about everything you wanted to know about the music. But if you've already seen it, then let's continue with what we're here to talk about. Some of what we already know from that video is that the Phantom's Revenge has been recognised as an acclaimed influence on the scene, as well as how St. Pepsi's Hit Vibes was said to be the first record to earn the future funk label. But what if the latter wasn't entirely accurate, and that there was one other release that in some way was the true future funk prototype? Because there was in fact one other artist that many have said was responsible for encapsulating the sound that would play a major part in the house-inspired sonic fingerprints of vaporwave. Much like the Phantom's Revenge, some have theorised that this particular name was considered to be one of the earliest examples and influences that eventually paved the way for future funk, something of which started with a little project that almost immediately expanded into a career for Brett Yules, better known by the alias Louis La Roche. For those who don't know who he is, Louis La Roche is a music producer from Norwich, England, who specialises in French house, new disco, and funk music, and has since dropped an extensive catalogue of albums, EPs, remixes, and singles in the span of over 12 years. Everything that you see of him now is all thanks to a record of his that was responsible for not only the launch of his career in the electronic scene, but also, according to numerous threads online, innovated the first wave of future funk. Before St. Pepsi, Macintosh Plus, and James Ferraro and the term vaporwave ever existed, the use of sample chopping was still at large thanks to a myriad of mainstream and underground artists ranging from Dr. Dre to DJ Shadow. But back in the days of when MySpace, MSN, and Ask Jeeves were in their prime as havens for the eventual growth of today's internet culture, the online music community was still trying to find a voice for themselves in all these tiny little chat rooms and websites. And one name that managed to stand out from the rest at the time was the teenage Louis La Roche, with the release of his debut, the Peach EP, which many in the community have deemed to be the first of its kind to harbour the signature future funk sound. I also have the man himself, Louis La Roche, with me in this video, and he's going to be giving you guys a special in-depth look at how he started out, how he learned about vaporwave, his point of view of being considered a future funk forefather, and more importantly, the production of what became the Peach EP.
So I started making music pretty young. I was 11 when I got my first pair of vinyl turntables, and I would take my parents' old vinyl collection of funk and R&B and disco records and layer over house and hip-hop loops from different battle records. And battle records, if you don't know, were sort of meant for turntablists to use at DJ battles. So they'd have like a lute drum breakbeat for like 4 minutes that you could scratch over. But I liked using them to play over other records. So when I was 12 and 13, I started messing around with music software, and I had a pirate copy of Cubase, which I eventually sort of ended up moving to FL Studio 6, I think, instead. And this is when I first sort of started to cut up records and sample records. And I sort of realize now in hindsight that the technique I was using at the time is almost like a hip hop kind of technique that they'd do when sampling records on an MPC, which is essentially where you'd sample from the kick to the snare, and then that would be one sample, and then the next sample would be from the snare to the kick, and then so on and so on. And when you sample that way, it kind of makes it easier to rearrange a song. So you can take one part of, at the beginning of the song and then perhaps another part from the end of the song and sort of re-edit it to make it sound like it was one piece. So it was around this sort of time when I was 10, 11, 12, 13, and I was listening to lots of electronic music. Fatboy Slim, Daft Punk, Basement Jaxx, The Prodigy, lots of like UK electronic music. But I mainly leaned more towards like the funky and disco side of things. So I found myself wanting to find more of that type of music. And now that I was starting to write music and sample records, I wanted to not only find like the producers and the writers of my favorite disco and funk music to then find out what other records they'd worked on, but also just house music generally. And that's when I discovered French house music. So Cassius and Mr. Wazo, DJ Falcon, and of course like Roulette and Crydamore. And then a little later, the whole Ed Banger and electro scene happened. So I started using a name called Night Facilities. And this was like before the whole blog house thing really started to kick off. And I was sharing ideas I had with like music forums and slowly started to share music to blogs. When I left school at 16, I went on to study music production at college, and my second year I actually went to Academy in London. And by that time, because I was using FL Studio for 3 years or so, I already knew sort of the basics of music production. And then I found myself writing 2 different types of music, one for like my grades, so then I'd pass on a bit of paper, and then some other songs that I was just writing for myself. And I know that like the Academy really just wanted me to write one thing and then they would grade it for whatever I was writing at the time. But for whatever reason, I decided to separate the two. So all this new music I was working on whilst I was at college and the Academy, that's when I decided in 2008 to come up with a French sounding name for the new music I was writing, which was sort of French house inspired. And the name was Louis La Roche, and really the name was inspired by Jacques Leconte, which was an alias that Stuart Price was using. And Stuart Price obviously being an English artist and producer that made like French sounding music. And the first Louis La Roche song was called Love, and I decided to put it out on Valentine's Day through my MySpace page. And that's when people started to talk about it on forums, and people thought I could have been Errol Alcan, Joe Goddard of Hot Chip, and then finally Thomas Bangalter from Daft Punk.
While it's evidently a French house record, the PGP is very much structured in the same way as a lot of future funk albums that were crafted between 2013 and 2015. Those were the days of when Supersex 420, Tendencies, Roller Girl and Lancaster were following that classic formula reminiscent of French house, which primarily centered itself on sampling a bunch of 45s from the 70s or the 80s. And of course, you would open up your DAW, incorporate basic 808 MIDI drums, use auto filters and phasers, topped up with a good sample chop that transposes the track up a few pitches and looping the catchiest part on an average of 2 to 4 minutes. Obviously, Vaporwave and future funk were non-existent labels back then, but that hasn't stopped the internet from debating who served as inspirations to the scene, with Louis being one of them. And that's all thanks to how he chose to execute his ideas at the time, later resulting in carbon copies that eventually led to the future funk moniker.
Through the blog attention that I got from Love, I decided to put out the other songs that I was working on and put out an EP called the Peach EP. So Love samples a Michael Jackson song called It's the Falling in Love, and it's a pretty slept on song from the Off the Wall album. And when you listen to the song, it's actually Patty Austin who starts singing the song before Michael does. And the main drums of the song only come in around like 17 seconds or so. And then Michael comes in, starts singing when the drums do. And the first line he says is cry. It's like an ad-lib. And I thought it was really cool and just decided to sample that one piece and sort of loop it. And just this cry part and just have it looping, cry, cry, cry. And then decided that obviously earlier in the song there's that part that Patty sings in the intro where she also sings cry. So wouldn't it be cool to like layer her part on top of Michael's part? And that's basically Love. So for the title song Peach, it was done in a similar way to Love, in the sense of taking a small section or sample of the song, which was the Diana Ross song, and kind of stretching it to its limit with what you could do. So chopping it up and layering different parts of it over each other, and just experimenting with that short piece of sample that was taken from the intro. And I really loved that short little piece of vocal that you hear in the sample as well that Diana does. And yeah, just sort of creating tension from just that one piece of sample. With the song Do You Remember, it was sort of the challenge of taking a song that everybody knows, but sort of taking a part of the verse that's not as famous and seeing how much you can repeat it. And that's something that I loved about French house records, is just taking a phrase or a line and just repeating it over and over and over, but sort of playing around with taking the kick out, bringing the kick back in, looping different sections of it, putting different sort of filter effects on it, and then sort of returning to what happened earlier in the song. So that really was the thinking behind Do You Remember. The song Get On Down has the same Gene Chandler sample that DJ Falcon used for the song Untitled, and it was kind of done purposely because I kind of wanted to put my stamp on it to say, this is French house. Like, I'm sampling the same song that one of the original sort of French house guys did, to sort of be like, this is a continuation. Like, I'm returning to that sound and trying to give it new life and trying to bring it into a new era sort of thing. So that was my thinking, but obviously I took a different portion of the song and tried to give it a different feel and just a different approach. With On the Floor, it was a case of just loving the groove and the funk of the original sample, and it was quite an obscure sort of funk track at the time. And yeah, I just liked that the vocal wasn't really that important, in the same way that Cassius 1999, the vocal almost becomes like an instrument. You don't really listen to the music that much. It's might as well be gibberish. So that was really the thinking behind that one. And it was sort of around this time that people slowly started sampling again, so 2007, 2008, and it was just the cool thing to do suddenly again. And I think that really helped with the success of the Peach EP. This self-titled song from the Peach EP, Peach, though it wasn't as big as Love, it sort of did quite well on YouTube, which was a relatively new thing at the time, and helped the EP spread. And all 5 songs on the Peach EP followed the same formula, really. It was just cutting up and looping disco samples, using 909 drum machine samples for the drums, and then lots of sidechain, probably too much, and using envelope filters as well. So the Peach EP sort of led to lots of labels getting in touch, wanting to sign me, and lots of artists asking for remixes. And I had an offer quite early on for Basement Jaxx to do a remix of their song Raindrops, and I was still at the academy at the time, and somehow my teachers found out about the EP. So I knew one of my tutors was an awesome bass player, and he now actually plays keys in Jamiroquai's band, believe it or not. But anyway, he played bass on the remix that we did for Basement Jaxx. And it was sort of around the time of the Basement Jaxx remix that I decided to start my own label, which was a pretty new concept at the time. Not many people were doing it. I actually quit the course at the academy because it was, sort of everything was getting busier with Louis, and I really had to just make the decision of, do I want to continue with the course and miss out on certain opportunities that, was being put on the table for Louis for the sake of, a grade on a piece of paper, or do I just quit the course and just hope that this works out? So it was a big gamble, but in hindsight I'm kind of glad that I did quit the course, and it was the best decision that I could have made, really.
The Peach EP may sound like future funk, when in actuality it's a product that belongs in the French house category. But it doesn't stop there with just this release. Louis himself believes that there are some other tracks that he made in the past from what was on the Peach EP contain similar elements adjacent to future funk. As a matter of fact, you'll find a lot of the tracks in his earlier discography alongside the Peach EP, as well as some of the compilations he took part in, sampled the same tracks that many other future funk artists have produced.
So I set up Ever After Records through my management, and I released my first EP that was actually in stores called the Me and Her EP. And that EP had 4 songs, but 3 really blew up. And that was Me and Her, Sunshine Hotel, and Be Brave. And that's a time when I really started to dig a bit deeper for samples and try to find these obscure records that no one had touched. Its success was really due to blogs, but also had radio play. It had Annie Mac from BBC Radio 1 played Sunshine Hotel, and she also included it on her first Annie Mac Presents compilation. And then, of course, again, YouTube just helped massively. So around this sort of time, I started messing around with Ableton, and I loved how easy it was to sample using it. And it was the same year that I released an EP called Super Soaker, and the title track was an example of how complex you could be with the sampling now because of the power of Ableton. That's something that I couldn't really do in FL. And in 2010, 2011, I did a couple of tracks called Airwave and Fake Tan for some free compilations called Shiny Disco Club. And that's when other people really started to come on board with sampling disco and making French house inspired music. And there were a few people doing it in 2008 and 9. Me, Phantom's Revenge, His Majesty Andre, Strip Steve, Voodoo Chili. In 2010 and 2011, that's when suddenly all these new names started to pop up, like Vanguard and Jean Tonique and Cartel. And then from there, like a year later in 2011, I released Gimme Gimme, which was sort of capitalized on the second wave of the disco house thing with like Duck Sauce. So it wasn't until about 2012 when I started hearing people talk about Vaporwave and future funk, and people would comment on like my YouTube channel and SoundCloud and say, hey, you know, this sounds like future funk. And I had like no idea what they were talking about. I didn't know what future funk was. So I decided to like do a bit of research, and that's when I found out about people like Washed Out and Macintosh Plus and the whole like slowed down R&B records becoming a real thing. But I noticed like 2 things. One was that some of the future funk and vaporwave stuff was like really, really creative and really cool. But then I also found some that just seemed like looped choruses of already well-known songs. And I think if you take a well-known song and you're sampling it in a creative way, or taking a part of the song that's not as recognizable and creating something new and cool out of it, then that's awesome. But I think just taking the chorus of an already famous song and sort of speeding it up and not really changing it and just adding like a house drum beat, it didn't really appeal to me that much, especially now that the internet plays such a larger role and there's not really such a thing as a rare record anymore. You know, everything is online, so you really have to dig deep to find something that's never been heard before. But that is honestly what I thought future funk was for a few years, just famous 80s funk and R&B records with house beats. And it wasn't until I gave it a second chance a few years later and really started noticing more creative records coming out. But I think that's a fine line though. I think if you go too crazy and you cut up a record into tiny pieces, it sort of loses its musical sort of feel. I mean, it's technical and you can do it, sure, but it's just messy to me. And I think what myself and others were doing in 2008, 2009, 2010 isn't really that different in terms of technicality or sound to what people are perhaps doing now. And I think music technology hasn't really progressed that much since back then. But I think I have more respect for people that add things to samples, whether that be chords or a bass line, adding original melodies rather than simply taking a record and sampling it and not really adding anything. I think future funk records that sort of impress me the most are the ones that are mixed well, mastered well, just sound awesome sort of sonically. I think downloading a DAW these days is sort of easier than it's ever been, and anyone can make a record now on their laptop at home in the bedroom. So I think showing your knowledge of your craft and really learning the tools you have is what makes you stand out, I think, in today's scene. One thing that I do love about the future funk scene is its sense of community, and I think that's something that was really missing when I first started. In the 90s, labels were like really tight and DJs would really get to know each other, but in the blog house days, everyone was sort of really out there for themselves. So, you know, every now and then you'd bump into artists perhaps at shows that were, you know, part of the same scene, but there really wasn't a community like there is now. And I think places like Discord and Reddit and just social media in general have really like helped bring it all together.
If you've seen the history of future funk, I had a section in the third quarter of the video entirely based on the French producer The Phantom's Revenge, who, like Louis La Roche, has been greatly admired and deemed a significant pioneer to the genre, according to the Vaporwave community. The Phantom's Revenge is primarily known for his minimalist approach and distinctive use of samples that Louis himself had also done in the early years of his career. Funnily enough, both Louis and Phantom have been longtime friends since the Bloghouse days, and Louis even made a remix of Phantom's debut and title track of the Absolute Ego Ride EP the same year as Peach was released.
Yeah, so me and Phantom started talking on MySpace back in late 2008, and that's how my remix of Absolute Ego Riot came to be. He just sent me a message and that was kind of it, really. And since then we've sent promos back and forth every now and then over emails. He'll play some of my stuff and I'll play some of his, so that's always cool, and I still love what he's putting out today. I think, you know, it's really nice that we both receive recognition for influencing a scene, but I know Phantom is a bit like me in terms of not really labeling what we do as future funk. You know, it's I think it's house music and it always has been. You know, it started in Chicago and sort of went from there. I think Todd Terry was really the first DJ that started sampling like actual disco records rather than disco inspired house music that became Chicago house. And then from there you've got, you know, DJs like in the 90s like DJ Sneak, Paul Johnson, Armando, Masters at Work, Basement Jaxx, Boris DeLugos, Moody Man, and that all sort of leads up to Daft Punk and then the whole French house scene, and then after that you've got the whole electro scene and Ed Banger, and then you've got what we were doing in 2008, 2009, and then that sort of leads up to the start of future funk, when people started using the term anyway. But to me, I think all of that is just house music to me. I think if you took the look and the aesthetic away from future funk and the whole anime thing and you just based it purely on the music, if you played a French house track from say 1999 and played it back to back with a modern future funk record and I said to you, can you tell me which is which, other than maybe the drum sound and the clarity, I'd say they're pretty much the same thing. You could argue that like the original French house sound was a lot more looped based than perhaps what future funk is, but other than that I'd say they're pretty much the same. For me, if someone says that one of my songs is, you know, proto future funk or disco house or French house or filter house, you know, that's fine and that's cool, but I think to me they're pretty much all subtle variations of the same thing. Of course I was influenced by what the French guys were doing, but then equally there was a lot of like British electronic music that was influencing me, so really it was just me making disco house, you know, house music that was inspired by disco, that sampled disco, and I think really that's what future funk is as well. I mean, if I said to you that on Wikipedia the definition of future funk says that it's a genre of electronic dance music characterized by a repetitive 4 on the floor beat with a tempo of 120 to 130 beats per minute, the subculture began from altering disco dance tracks to give them a more mechanical beat and deeper bass lines. Well, that's not actually the Wikipedia for future funk, that's the Wikipedia for house music. So, you know, they're the same. They're the same. They sound the same to me. And I mean, I get it. People like labeling things and that's cool. But for me personally, like, you know, they're all much of the same.
So even though Louis La Roche and the Phantom's Revenge don't adapt as Vaporwave musicians, it's still really heartwarming to see how much they admired the scene for its dedicated companionship, as well as acknowledging how future funk as a whole has seen Louis and Phantom as influences. They're definitely not the only artists to have made some sort of impact on such a loyal collective online, as other producers such as Daft Punk, Eric Prydz, Mogjo and Justice have been mentioned as a few other names that have played a part in everything that has become what it is today. The great thing about music is that it's limitless in how it can be molded, and what little intricacies from another style can be responsible for the shape of various genres to come. Future funk is only a fraction of what makes up the entirety of Vaporwave, in the same way as how disco or techno make up a small portion of electronic music. Some may sound incredibly similar, especially when you compare future funk with French house in the same manner as comparing jungle with drum and bass, but they still have their attributes that make them stand out from one another. All in all, it's always fun researching this topic and understand who or what sowed the seeds and how everything has managed to develop over time. So let's continue to expand on this community and keep experimenting with ideas to see what could come next for the whole of Vaporwave.
So, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The first Future Funk EP, or so we assume is the first Future Funk EP, by Louis La Roche. And goddamn, it was a real treat to actually be able to get him involved in this video. Louis, if you're watching this, man, thank you very goddamn much for taking part in this video. I wouldn't have expected you to agree to taking part in it, so like that, I'm really thankful for that, so thank you very much, man. Now you're probably thinking, what's the skinny on the vinyl giveaway, Daydream? Well, ladies, gentlemen, guys, gals, non-binary pals, would you like to have your own copy of the Split EP by Supersex 420 and Tendencies? Because now's your chance to actually win it. Some of you already know that this is one of my favorite future funk releases of all time. It's pretty quintessential to the whole future funk and vaporwave scene, and I actually asked Fiber if I could get my hands on another copy so I could do this giveaway, and obviously he agreed to it, and it is completely sealed with a little Montam sticker. It's not completely sealed because I wanted to put the Montam sticker in there just so it didn't get lost, but you know what I mean. It hasn't been played and it's in perfect condition, at least from what I can see here. Now, in terms of actually entering the competition to win this delicious vinyl, first off, make sure you're subscribed to my channel, following me on Twitter, and last but not least, leave a comment below saying what your favorite Vaporwave album of 2020 is, and I will randomly pick a winner in the comment section below, and I will announce the winner on Twitter. And like I said, you're gonna have to follow me on Twitter because that way I can actually announce you, I can actually DM you if you've won. But yeah, nonetheless, I hope you're all excited for this, and I want to thank you all again for being subscribed to this channel, watching my videos, and you know, just spreading the good word about Vaporwave and future funk. Like, the last few months of doing this channel has always been so amazing, and I just wanted to do a little giveaway to show my gratitude for you motherfuckers. Like, that, you have no idea how much that really means to me. And of course, big love from your boy down under, Daydream Deluxe.